Thank you for taking the time to read my story. I'm very excited about your upcoming Chernobyl movie. It inspired me to share a story from my family's history. This is my grandmother's story. We'll call her Natalia. My family is originally from Russia. My grandmother relocated to the United States in the late 40s, shortly after World War II. This experience took place in the fall of 1941. Hitler had initiated Operation Barbarossa, which called for a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. I don't remember the name of my grandmother's village, but I know that it was only a few kilometers away from Leningrad, and most of the people who lived there worked at a lumber mill. If you were to read about many of the well-known battles of World War II, you would undoubtedly come across the Siege of Leningrad. I'm not a historian by any means, but from what I understand, the Nazis formed a blockade around the city, stopping all supply runs to both the Red Army and the citizens. What is often overlooked is that many of the small villages and towns on the way to Leningrad were crushed by the Germans with little to no resistance. When the war began, many of these small villages were kept in the dark about the German advance, and with my grandmother being only a child at the time, there was a lot that she didn't know. On one gloomy September morning, she was playing outside with some of the other neighborhood children when she heard her father shouting as he ran down the road.
"The Germans are coming! The Germans are coming! Run for your life!"
Almost as soon as her father was done shouting, a loud cracking sound cut through the air, and the house next to Natalia's was instantly destroyed. My grandmother remembered the wails of agony coming from the pile of rubble. Her neighbors, who were still inside the house, were now trapped beneath the collapsed structure. Chaos erupted in the small town as villagers began to flee their homes. She was scooped up by her parents as they joined the rest of the panicked villagers. She remembered looking over her father's shoulder to see what she described as monsters on wheels chasing after them, crushing houses beneath their tracks as they closed in. Unfortunately for the villagers, the settlement was located next to a massive gorge. There was one of those stereotypical wooden bridges held together by rope, which was the only way across. The bridge had been deemed unsafe because of its decaying state. It was only used by fishermen to reach the rivers on the other side. The villagers called it the Fisherman's Path. There were plans to build a new bridge, but nothing ever came of it, a decision that the villagers would come to regret now that the Nazis were at their backs, and their only hope for escape was to cross the decrepit bridge. The village was protected by Russian troops, but they had been completely outmatched by the Nazis and also retreated to this bridge, presumably just before the attack on the village. When the crowd of frightened villagers gathered at the bridge entrance, they had guns pointed at them by the soldiers. The commanding officer explained to them that if everyone began running across the bridge at once, it would surely collapse, and that only a handful of people could go at a time. However, with the sounds of German tanks drawing closer, the soldiers were unable to maintain order, and the villagers began pushing past them to get to the bridge. Gunfire erupted as the soldiers began firing at their own people. Natalia's mother, my great-grandmother, was tragically caught in the crossfire and died in front of her, gunned down by the very men who were supposed to protect her. Chaos erupted once again as the soldiers struggled to keep back the frightened villagers. My great-grandfather Dmitri was somehow able to avoid the gunfire and make his way past the blockade with Natalia in his arms. The officer ordered the men to shoot Dmitri, but when they saw that he had a child in his arms, none of them could bring themselves to carry out that order. My great-grandfather cried out,
"Please take my daughter across the bridge. I will stay behind, but please take her. She's only a child. Please!"
My young grandmother erupted into tears. The last thing she remembers is looking over the shoulder of the soldier who was carrying her across the bridge. My great-grandfather called out to her one last time,
"I love you, Natalia. I love you, Natalia. Never forget your family. We will always be with you."
A loud crashing sound was heard before she lost consciousness. She woke up sometime later within the city of Leningrad. Much like her home village, the Nazis had surrounded the city, cutting off all communications and supplies. She stayed in a library that was converted into a shelter for citizens who had lost their homes. The soldier who rescued her would check in from time to time and would bring her bread whenever he could. Over the next 2.5 years, the city was constantly bombed by the Germans, and the lack of rations led to mass starvation among the citizens. Despite all this, Leningrad was never completely overtaken by the Nazis, and my grandmother survived. When she relocated to the United States, she eventually met my grandfather and started a family. She lived a good life until she passed away peacefully in 2003. Her memory inspires me every day. I couldn't imagine the horror of losing my parents and my home, and still having the will and determination to survive. Let us remember the men and women who fought bravely and died in World War II. I can only hope if that same evil ever returns to threaten our world, that we can all set aside our differences and unite against it, once again. I will end my story by sharing a quote from the great Winston Churchill. "It's not enough that we do our best. Sometimes, we have to do what is required." I'm 30 years old. My family moved to the United States when I turned 14. I grew up in Russia, in a town called Kirov. It was big enough to house a full spread of criminal activity, from organized crime to cannibalistic hobos. These few stories are not tied together with anything else other than a cultural connection, and hopefully will give you a small glimpse of the state of Russia during the 90s, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When I was very little, we lived in a typical Russian 5-story apartment building, in what was considered to be a middle-class neighborhood. It was fairly quiet, with nothing much happening, so us kids could play outside for as long as we wanted to, without adult supervision. I remember a man who lived on the first floor of our building. His kitchen window overlooked the staircase, which ran out to the sidewalk. He was probably in his mid to late 30s, always wearing a dirty wife beater. Never a clean shave. Every time, it seemed, when I would walk or ride my bike past his window, he would jump up from his chair and begin to yell and shout as loud as he could at me, swearing, calling me all kinds of names, and threatening me. He would always do this with excessive violent movements and facial expressions. As a 4-year-old boy, I would just stand there in horror, watching him do this crazy, murderous rampage. He would fall on his elbows on the windowsill and shake his head feverishly, spitting out curses and death threats at me, with his eyes bulging. He would punch his chest with all of his strength and was almost in tears from his psychotic rage. He would announce his hatred towards me and how much he wanted me dead. And if that wasn't enough, he would pretend to be going to the door, as if finally having found the resolution to go through with it. Then would come back to the window and would start shouting again. I just remember being shocked and would just stand there and let the horror overtake me, leaving the crazy man just staring at me out of his window. One day, the man disappeared. No more insane harassment at the window. Being a kid, I just moved on with my life and didn't think about it for years, until much later I told my parents about him and what he would do to me as a kid. The story that they told me confirmed my suspicions about him. Around one of the last times I ever saw him, a strange occurrence happened in our city. Body parts were found scattered throughout our city, all far from each other. They all belonged to one unfortunate man, whose wife plotted to kill him for the sake of acquiring his apartment and belongings. The woman's brother happened to be the freak living downstairs, who apparently killed the husband and dismembered his body in a tub and discarded the pieces throughout the city, including the head. Everything led to the wife, and it didn't take her long to blame the entire thing on her dear brother, who to this day is sleeping in some dark cell, far away in the cold. When I was in 8th grade, My school started to have roof problems. It was an old building that used to belong to some merchant who lived back in the times of the czars. And every year it seemed to give in more and more, until finally the ceiling fell on a class full of students. For the time that it would take to restore the building, the student body would have to attend classes in public school number 22. I still remember it clearly. It was a fortress of bad behavior bordering on homicide. The students of public school 22 mostly came from awful circumstances. At the time, street fighting was also very common in Russia, and the fights would rarely end with just a black eye or a busted lip. We're talking broken bones, fractured skulls, coma, or death. One day, as my friends and I were talking in the hallway between classes, a big, bald kid approached us with the entourage of hopeless degenerates. He told us that they had had enough of us, and were planning on beating the life out of us after school. They didn't like us from the start because our school was considered preppy, and they acted as if we were intruding upon their territory. He told us that they were all going to be there, and it was gearing up to be a great show. We knew immediately that he meant what he said, as this guy had a bit of a reputation at the school, and most kids were afraid of him. He was one of those people who would swing at anyone who did anything to annoy him. And he wasn't alone. There were many who had his back. We told our teachers what he said, and they secretly let us go 20 minutes before the last class was over. My friends and I all banded together, as we got dressed for the winter day outside and left the school. The plan was to stick together and walk to the bus stop. I got on my bus and stood by the window. The route led right by the school, and I would be able to see the courtyard in front of the main entrance and what could be happening there. What I saw became etched in my mind for the rest of my life. On the white snow, in the clearing just before the large doors of public school number 22, was an assembly of between 200 and 250, mostly male figures, dressed in black colors, forming a giant circle. In the middle of the circle I could see a fight taking place. Just two of them, one with his arms thrown open as if taunting his opponent, and the other, someone who did not look like they wanted to be there. This turned out to be a big operation on their part. I later learned that once they found out we left early, they decided to beat up on some of their own, and some poor random kid was picked and beaten so hard he ended up in the ICU. Since that school was very small in numbers, and some parents altogether decided to homeschool their children, while our original school was still under repairs, we would have easily been outnumbered 10-1. I hate to think what could have happened to me and my friends if our teachers hadn't let us out early that day. The next day, armed security was on the school premises, and they stayed there until we were able to go back to our original school. This last story is my personal claim to victory in the game of life or death, which happens to fall into our hands from time to time, for seemingly no apparent reason at all. I was only 9 at the time, and we had just moved to a better location. Our apartment was on the 6th floor, and was the last one on the landing. It was the furthest you could go from the entrance of the building, and was fairly secluded. The staircase was also completely indoors, with 4 apartments to a floor. One day, I came home from school around 2 p.m. My parents weren't due back for at least another 3 hours, and I set about doing my usual homework, watching TV, and emptying out the fridge. It was around the time that I settled down for an episode of Babylon 5 that I heard the front doorbell ring. This was very odd, as my parents both had their keys, and no one else usually visited around this time of day. I went over to the front door and asked, "Who is it?" I heard a man answer back, "Hello there, I am from the electrical company. We are doing a routine check on the electrical meters. May I come in and inspect yours? It will only take a minute." I looked through the peephole and saw a young man, probably nearing his 30s, very clean, neatly dressed, with his hair combed to the side. He held a clipboard in his hand, with some papers attached. I was about to twist open the lock when something caught my eye. Because of the fisheye view I had on the landing, I could also see a little extra to the sides, on my left and the man's right. I saw a light bouncing from what looked like a sharp metal object. It took me a second, but I clearly saw what it was. It was the cutting edge of an axe. Someone was standing right next to the door, attempting to hide from view, holding an axe in their hands. At this point, my memory gets blurry. I remember stepping away from the door and creeping into my room, which was the furthest in the hallway. I closed my door and didn't come back out until my parents got back. The bell kept ringing for a few more minutes, and then it finally fell silent. I never told anyone about it until now. So these were my stories, and I think there's always something important to learn from encounters like this.